And ma'am, thank you so much for joining us. Will you take a moment to introduce yourself? You represent the 132nd District. Could you also take us a moment to tell us what that district encompasses?
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everybody. First, I'll say I know this is really awkward doing on Zoom, so please bear with me and ask lots of questions. I'll try to make this as entertaining as I can, doing it from my house. But my name is Crystal. I am the state representative for the 132nd Legislative District, which is essentially downtown Springfield. The northernmost part of my district is Commercial Street, and then I go past Missouri State University about 3 or 4 blocks down, and then it's essentially National and West Bypass. Now, as you guys well know, no legislative district is a solid square. I have some streets that, I have all of Walnut Street to Glenstone and some places that pop out. I am also the minority floor leader in the Missouri House of Representatives. So that means that I am the leader of the Democratic caucus, and that encompasses the whole state of Missouri for the House of Representatives. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. I grew up in Webster County. I came to Springfield to go to Missouri State University. I am a mom of 3 and a social worker by trade. So that is my brief introduction.
Great. Now, if you don't mind, we invited you so you could tell us a little bit about how you came to get into the career that you're in now. Also, if you could tell us what your day-to-day life is like, and wrap up with a discussion of why you identify with the Democratic Party.
Definitely. So I honestly was never engaged in politics or government growing up. I am not from a family that really, beyond voting, my parents didn't really talk about things. We didn't watch the news, and I was never really up to date on political happenings. When I went to school at Missouri State, I started studying social work. And I learned very quickly that everything I wanted to do as a social worker when it came to helping people was dictated by policy through governmental actions. I first got into social work because honestly, I grew up most of my life to a single mother. I'm the first in my family to graduate high school and then go on to college. And so a big portion of my childhood, I was in decent poverty. I watched my mom struggle while working full time and trying to raise some kids. And so I really wanted to get into social work to try to help folks like my mom. And then when I started studying policy, realizing that government had so much say over what you can do as a social worker, I decided to do my internship that you have to do before you graduate in Jefferson City as a legislative intern. It was at that point, and Mr. Crocker's heard me say this a lot, it was really about 2 weeks into my internship in Jefferson City that I realized that the elected officials had no idea what it was like to grow up in a place like I came from. They really didn't seem representative of understanding what it's like to not know how to pay your bills and have to choose between paying your rent or eating that week. They didn't know what it was like for my family. And at that point, I decided that I wanted to run for office one day. I'm a firm believer that we need folks making decisions from all walks of life, and we need everybody at the table. And at the time, and I could potentially say even now in Missouri, our government is not representative of our people in terms of it being extremely diverse, whether that is, ethnically, gender-based, but financially. And so I decided as a college senior that one day I was going to run for office. At that point, internships open the door for everything. I encourage all of you to try to find an internship that you're interested in, because it was my internship that got me my first job out of college. I graduated on that Friday, and on Monday, I started working for the United States Senate doing constituent services work. And essentially what that is when Missourians had problems with their government, their federal government, say their student loan repayment program wasn't going into effect, or veterans weren't getting their benefits, you can call your elected officials, and they have people who work for them that help you navigate, and they will contact those agencies on your behalf and try to get your problem resolved. And so I did that for a few years. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot about our federal government, and I learned again about a lot of the failures of government when we had citizens needing to call their elected officials to simply get their veterans benefits, something that they were promised. After I worked there for a few years, I got into the campaign world of politics, so to speak, and I worked on a United States Senate campaign in Southwest Missouri, running the Southwest Missouri portion of it. And I realized very quickly I hated politics. I hated campaigning. That side of it is not something that I loved. And so from there, I got back into the nonprofit sector. I worked for many years for a local agency called Care to Learn that's based in Springfield that provides basic needs for kids in our schools. So hunger, health, and hygiene. And I did a lot of poverty training, helping our educators learn more about how to identify what kids' needs were, et cetera. And I did that until this House seat opened. My predecessor termed out. We can serve 8 years in the Missouri House. And when the seat opened, I knew I wanted to run. It was, it wasn't the best time. It's never the right time to run for office. As I said, I'm a mom. Our youngest was about 1 at the time. But really what did it for us, and you all may or may not remember this, but around the time that I decided to run for office, Springfield City Council adopted an ordinance for sexual orientation and gender identity protections. In the state of Missouri, prior to the Supreme Court ruling that just happened, you can be fired or denied housing for being part of the LGBT community. So Springfield adopted an ordinance to bring those protections just for the city of Springfield. And then that was swiftly overturned by a vote of the people. And for us, for my family and my friends, that was a big hit. I have a lot of friends who that affected deeply. And so, as a parent, my husband and I, honestly, it was that election, we stayed up very late discussing what kind of future we wanted for our kids and what kind of community we wanted for our kids. And with that seat being open, we decided to run that year. And so that was the 2016 election. So we decided to run for office. I jumped in. I had a primary and a general my first time. Fortunately, I won both pretty overwhelmingly and was able to serve. And since then, I have been elected an additional time in 2018, and I'm up again for re-election here in November. So that's kind of the path that got me here. I will tell you, since becoming an elected official, I have continued to learn way more than I ever imagined I would. My interest level has changed a lot. As a social worker, I went into this work really wanting to focus on vulnerable populations, people who needed assistance, and of course, education, with this district having all of the universities, OTC, and the largest public school in the state. Education was something that was really important to me as well. But I can tell you, since becoming a state representative, that interest level has drastically widened, and that's been a combination because of reaching out to my constituents and knocking doors, talking to voters, but then also just seeing what is happening in Jefferson City has drastically changed my perspectives, as well as how I vote on things. It's definitely true that you ebb and flow, or at least I think a good representative should ebb and flow in terms of their willingness to learn and be open to changing their opinions on things. I would say now, one of the things that I am most engaged in, which I never would have imagined, is the state budget. My first 2 years, I got to serve on the budget committee, and now as floor leader, I get to pick everyone who serves on all the committees, and the budget is definitely the most important place to be. But I've also had the great opportunity to learn so much about where our state is spending its money and where it's not. And of course, I have lots of opinions on where I think it should be, if you guys want to talk about that. But then also other issues like local control. I never thought in a million years that I would be standing on the House floor advocating for local control to the amount that I do. So often in Jefferson City, the state legislature takes away power from local municipalities to make decisions, whether that's having a factory farm being able to be within certain distance of people's water, or local municipalities being able to decide things for themselves, or undoing local votes, like the people of St. Louis voted for their own city to have an increased minimum wage. And then Jefferson City came back and said, no, you guys can't do that. No matter what you guys want to do, we're saying no, and undid that vote within my first year. So local control is something that I have learned a lot about, and have definitely has become one of the most important issues for me in Jefferson City. I would add to that, healthcare is something that we are always fighting about whether, and a lot of that comes from the budgetary standpoint of what we're going to fund and what we're not going to fund. And transparency has been a big thing. Since being minority floor leader, we are in what's considered a super minority in Jefferson City. There are 163 seats. Of those, the Democrats hold 48 of them. So that means that essentially we don't even have to be there for there to be a quorum for the other side to do whatever they want. And so a big part of what we do, we obviously work together on a lot of things. We've gotten lots of bills passed. I've gotten a few pieces of legislation through just by working with folks on the other side. But when it comes to heavy partisan things, we try to stop a lot of things. We try to make bills better. But a big part of my job as floor leader is also to hold everyone accountable. The Republican Party right now has all of the statewide offices except for one. And then with supermajorities in both the House and the Senate, a big part of my role is to make sure that things are being done ethically and transparently. And so you may see a lot coming from my office about making sure that folks who are supposed to be enrolled in Medicaid are enrolled. We saw last year 100,000 children who are supposed to be covered by Medicaid get kicked off the rolls. So a big part of my job was, why did that happen? Asking for committee hearings to investigate that. We're currently investigating the medical marijuana licensing that has been dramatically mishandled. And I think you'll hear both sides of the aisle say that. And so we're doing some deep dives into making sure all of that was done according to the law. So because of my role as floor leader, I get to wear a lot of hats. And then the other hat that I also wear that I won't dive too much into is the campaign side of things. So both leaders of the House on the respective sides of the aisle are also in charge of the campaign pieces and trying to essentially grow our caucuses, whether that's through fundraising or campaigning. So I also have that job responsibility too. And I'm also in charge of all of the staff for the Democratic Caucus. So that means our researchers, our folks who help us write bills and all of that. So I get to do a lot of really cool things. And I've had, it's a great honor to get to lead the caucus because I get to be exposed to all facets of state government that we are doing, which is a unique opportunity that not everyone gets. And for the last question before we dive into the questions you all have, why am I a Democrat? Why do I identify as a Democrat? And I'll go back to, as I said early on, I did not come from a family that identified one way or the other. I will tell you, my parents are avid Republican voters and always have been. But it wasn't anything that we had really talked about growing up. And for me, ultimately, it's about where our priorities lie. And I will 100% say, since being in Jefferson City, my belief in the Democratic Party has only become more steadfast because of where I think we should be spending our money and what our priorities should be. I believe that the government's role is to support people, whether that's through healthcare and social services, whether that's through supporting through local control and making sure that individuals can have what they say, that we're not undoing the will of voters because we think they're confused, et cetera, et cetera. And, time and time again, the policies that our caucus is pushing are focused on individuals. I am a firm believer in supporting businesses. My husband is a small business owner in town that employs about 45 people. I am a firm believer in supporting all of those things, making our state one that businesses want to come to, that our infrastructure is supported, all of those things, that our tax structure is something that folks want to move into, that they want to live in a place that is affordable, but they also want quality education. They also want equal opportunity. One of the things I hear a lot about for our constituents in Springfield is, my kids are here going to college, how do we get them to stay? That's something the business community is also asking. So, our role as a government is to answer all of those questions at once, right? But I definitely believe that the Democratic Party does it from a very people-centric focused, and that's something that I definitely believe in.
So we were happy enough to receive dozens and dozens of questions from students about you and about your positions. And if you don't mind me reading through a few of them, starting with Haley Highfill in another one of my classes, what's really the first thing you do about COVID-19 if you could mandate anything?
Well, I will be very honest with you that we should have done things back in March. When it comes to COVID-19, we are in a different situation now than before this all started. And you can actually go online and see, we put together a policy proposal list for not only the State House, but also the governor to take actions back in March. Those were things like masking. Those were things like funneling PPE and making sure that not only our nurses in our hospitals had what they needed, but our jails had what they needed, that our schools had what they needed. There was an array of funding mechanisms and things that we really wanted to focus on. Rapid testing, making sure that was accessible. Unfortunately, none of those actions were taken early enough, in my opinion. The governor declared a state of emergency. I believe it was about 2 or 3 weeks after I had asked him to. And then what's important about the state of emergency is it opens up the ability that he, as the governor, has to make decisions. In a state of emergency, we can move things more rapidly. We can direct funding more rapidly. He could make a lot of decisions without having to go through the legislature. And in a time like this, where we're looking at a real crisis, I think it's really important that he have that ability to do so. But it was just really delayed. And there's just been delay after delay after delay. When the federal money came in, the CARES Act money, we were asking for large authority for the governor to have spending ability to funnel that money down to our local county health departments. And that stuff wasn't given. There's actually conversations right now about us having to go back and do a special session in a couple of weeks to grant the spending authority that we tried to do back in March, because we have buckets of money from the federal government still sitting in our state coffers that hasn't been funneled down yet. And so when we look at things like what's happening here in Springfield, where there was an article in the paper yesterday that our hospitals are not able to keep up. A lot of that comes down to us not getting the funding and the money that we were given from the federal government to them in a timely way. So to answer the question at hand, though, what can we do now? There's still a lot that can be done. I am a believer in masks. I have personally lost loved ones to COVID, and I definitely believe in the mask mandate. And I think that's something that the governor should be doing. When we look at the health officials locally, one of the things that our hospitals are really struggling with is the fact that Springfield is a hub, and we have folks from other counties that don't have the mask mandate coming in for work every day, coming in maybe in this classroom every day. And without having uniformity around that, it is causing a lot of problems for our health professionals. So that's something that I think that the governor could be doing now. But I would really like to see, as I said, that funding being funneled down to the local folks who can be spending it appropriately. And also, I want to go back to, in Greene County, we're having a huge problem in our jail right now with COVID-19, not only for our inmates, many of which have not been charged with any crimes yet, but also our staff. So I'm going to repeat that because I think it's important to know we have folks in Greene County Jail who have not been charged with anything, who have contracted COVID because the proper protocols were not put in place. That's things like PPEs. We have inmates who are reusing them, and that's all throughout the state. So, there's a lot that we could still be doing. I would also like to add provisions in for our school systems. Right now, a lot of our teachers, because there is no uniform decision for our school system in Missouri, obviously every school is handling this differently. But what I'm really concerned about is protections for our staff and our teachers. We have a lot of teachers in school districts who can't take sick time because it will affect their retirement and affect everything else. And they're not being given those protections that essential workers should be. And I would say the same with our grocery workers and everybody else. Essential workers, if we deem these folks essential workers and they have protections when it comes to liability and their job placement and making sure that their job stays intact and their retirement stays intact. And that's something that I think we need to be discussing too.
Ma'am, what are your views? This is a question from another student, Gabby Green. What are your views and opinions about the Black Lives Matter movement? Do you think that individuals need to earn a 4-year degree in criminal justice to become a police officer? Do you think that current police officers need to receive more education and training on how to handle certain situations, or if they should not be involved at all?
Yeah, so that is a big question, and I'm going to preface my answer with saying that I am a white girl from the Midwest, and so my perspectives are not nearly as important as individuals of color when it comes to how this all is handled. But 100% yes to to most of those questions. I have myself attended Black Lives Matter rallies and protests both in St. Louis after the Stockley verdict and here in Springfield. I have traveled, I have met with these folks. I have met with leaders and listened to what they're asking for. And on the flip side of that, I have met with our sheriff or with our police chiefs. I have met with police officers and really tried my best to take in what are the problems at hand and what do we need to be doing. And bottom line, there's so much that can be done. I will tell you that here locally, our police want more. They want more training. They want social workers coming into the field with them. They don't want to have to go to calls and understand how to deal with drug addicts and what does that mean. They want to see those programs better funded. And so when that conversation around defunding police comes about and you hear all these hyper partisan, jabs at either side of the conversation, the reality is everybody on the ground wants funding for things to make their jobs better. Not only does that protect police officers if we've got social workers going with them or going in lieu of them when it comes to certain situations, that not only makes a better outcome for the individual citizens that we're talking about, but it also protects police officers too. When we talk about training, yes, they need more training, 100%. As a social worker, I know how to deal with somebody who is having a mental health breakdown in a way that a law enforcement officer does not. I mean, there's just point blank. We have a different skill set and a different training. And more often than not, the individuals you will see here in our local jail are dealing with mental health crisis or addiction crisis. There are, and with that comes crimes, of course, but the root causes of those things are what we need to be talking about. I highly respect what individuals going to the street are doing. Listen, if folks have been advocating for so long for accountability, but also just changes in structural programming and how things are funded, as have the police. Police have come to Jefferson City so many times asking for changes to our gun laws, asking for more funding for things that we are not giving them. And when nobody's listening, you protest, you rally. And I think that is extremely important and something that we should not be condemning, that we need to be listening to folks. Now, obviously, when we go into the deeper conversation of riots and looting and burning and all of that, again, as a white individual, I am not going to speak on whether I think that is, the right outlet for somebody's rage by any means. But yes, we should be following laws and we should be protecting folks and we shouldn't be adding to. But I will also say that, the events that I have been to, the negative things that have happened, the looting, the fighting, all of that are not folks who are there for the movement. They're there because they see an opportunity. And I want to say that goes on both sides of that conversation. I don't think one side is taking advantage of that, but there are folks who come to those events who are just trying to cause trouble. And I will say the reverse of that, where I've seen, rallies on the other side of the conversation and folks go to cause trouble. And, I think that there's a healthy balance that we can find when it comes to using your First Amendment rights, but I will obviously never condone, burning of small businesses or any of that stuff. But I can tell you firsthand, I've been to several of these events and have never once experienced any of that or witnessed any of that. But that's a very long answer to say that simply things are not going okay right now. No matter where you stand on this issue, it's not okay. Black folks don't feel safe sleeping at home, and that's a problem. Our police officers don't feel safe going to work. That's a problem. And we need to be having this conversation. And if it takes protests and riots, this big thing that's happening nationally to make elected officials be brave enough to have this really hard conversation that they don't want to have, because it's like, you're not going to get reelected if you're against the police, or you're not going to get reelected if you're not standing up for Black folks or whatever. We need to just be brave enough to have this conversation in a real way so that we can make Missouri and our country a place that folks feel safe to exist in.
Changing gears just a little bit, as you noted, it's 2020. We have an election coming up in just a few weeks. One of the most contentious things on the ballot is Amendment 3. And we'll talk about that as a class maybe later this semester. But what is Amendment 3? What do you support it? Do you oppose it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so in 2018, there was a ballot initiative called Clean Missouri. And for those of you who may not know, a ballot initiative process is this really cool thing we have in Missouri and throughout the country, where if the legislature does something you don't like, or they're not doing something that you want them to do, citizens can gather petitions and put something on the ballot. Happens all the time. And I think it's a really important part of democracy to have that extra check. And we've seen ballot initiatives from medical marijuana to minimum wage to Medicaid. This one was Clean Missouri. And what this did, it did several things, but it changed the lobbyist gifts that you can get. So Missouri used to have a really bad problem with lobbyist gifts going to elected officials. When I was an intern, there were meals everywhere. It was insane. It's gotten better, but Clean Missouri made it a cap of $5. The biggest thing that it did was change the way that our districting happens. And I'm going to get really nerdy for a moment. But every year when we have our census, then we redraw the district lines, both for Congress, and Missouri has actually lost seats over the years. That's why the census is so important. But then also the state house and the state senate, we redraw the districts that we represent. Up until Clean Missouri, the process was elected officials, the minority floor leader and the floor leader, would pick a handful of representatives and say, you're going to serve on this committee to draw the maps. And they would look at all the things that they're supposed to, and politicians would draw the maps. Then those maps went through the courts for approval. It was essentially the process. It's more weedy than that, but that's essentially the process. What Clean Missouri did was take it out of the hands of elected officials and have the first person who draws the maps be a demographer, a map maker. That position would be, it would go through both the auditor's office and the Senate. So essentially the way this process works is the auditor's office opens for applications and people apply. What happened was, I'm going to pause. So that change was on the ballot in 2018. With 62% of the vote, Clean Missouri became part of the state constitution. So the way it is right now, we've not actually gone through this process yet, but the way our state constitution lays it out, the auditor's office accepts applications for a demographer. And this year there were 7 people who applied. The auditor's job is to then look at those resumes and say, okay, you're qualified, you're not qualified. And so out of the 7, 6 people were qualified. Then the auditor sends all of those 6 people to the state senate for them to pick who that person is. Then that person draws the maps. And then when they draw the maps, it goes back to the same process where it has to be approved through the Senate and through the courts. So that passed, as I said, overwhelmingly. We have started that process where the auditor had sent 6 of those resumes to the Senate. The Senate has not done anything with it yet. So what Amendment 3 is on the ballot in November is that the legislature in Jefferson City, many of them believed that the citizens were confused by the ballot language and didn't actually want Clean Missouri to pass. So they decided to try to undo it, essentially. And they passed through what one side is calling Cleaner Missouri, what the other side is calling Dirty Missouri, to change the way we do our maps again. So the way, if Clean Missouri passes, not only does it really go back to how it was before, where the politicians are the ones drawing the maps, it also changes the way that we count people. And I think this is an important thing that nobody talks about at all. If Amendment 3 passes, we will be the only state in the history of our nation to change the way we count individuals, where we won't be counting children or we won't be counting inmates. We will only be counting people who are allowed to vote. So think through all like immigrants who are living here, paying taxes, who may not have their citizenship to vote yet. None of those folks are counted. And so what that means, a district like mine, where I have the county jail, and it's my job to represent those folks because they're residing there. And if they have a problem, they call me, and trust me, my office handles a ton of them. They are factored into my 37,000 people right now, as is all of the children who reside in Springfield or in my legislative district. And if that changes, then it's my belief that our representation will really be off, because those individuals will not be counted, kids will not be counted, immigrants will not be counted. And so I may represent a whole lot more people than the district next to mine, which is really unfair representation in my opinion. But I think it's important to know that never ever in the history of our country has it been done this way. And when we're talking about how we count people and how we represent them, I think that is a really big discussion that needs to be had. Unfortunately, neither side of this issue is really discussing that because it's such a nuanced and really, politically nerdy thing to be discussing. And of course, it doesn't play well on TV to sit and talk about whether or not we're counting children and to get into the nuances of that. So I am voting no on Amendment 3. But I will also say, issue aside, I have significant problem with citizens saying, we want you to do this, and then the legislature coming back before implementation and saying, you guys must have been confused. You don't know what you were doing. Let us help you. We've got this. We're smarter than you. And I 100% mean it when I say elected officials during that debate said the citizens didn't understand it. It was too confusing for them. Those are quotes from legislators' mouths. And I have a significant problem with elected officials who think that they are better than the people they represent and that they are smarter than them. 62% of Missourians told us to do this, and we need to do it.
So the most common question you got, man, was about minimum wage. Like 2-3 dozen people wrote up to ask about it. Scott Finch asks, first of all, he says he agrees people should be working for a livable wage. But he says, my question is, how do you plan on keeping the local economy from experiencing inflation if you increase minimum wage?
Yeah, so that is, the never-ending question when we talk about minimum wage. And I appreciate that this question comes out with that, if you're working, you should be living. You should be having a living wage. You shouldn't have to work 40 hours a week and not be able to survive. I think that is just like an American value that we should have. But how do you deal with the inflation piece? And I think that is an important question that is sometimes hard to prove factually on either side of that conversation. I will tell you that it's my belief that if individuals are earning living wages, they are much more likely to spend that money back into the economy, which is step number one. If folks are able to pay their bills and not having to choose between paying their rent and whether or not they eat, then they're going to be spending that money. And you can actually look statistically on who saves money and who doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. The very wealthy people in our country are the ones who don't spend their money. Now, that they may buy a boat, but they're the ones putting their money in stocks and in savings and in places that are actually not filtering back through the economy. The people who sustain the economy are the working class folks, because they don't have quite enough money to put back into savings. They're not buying stocks. What they're doing is taking their family out to dinner. They're paying for ballet lessons. They're doing, the things that really keep the economy afloat is the middle class. And so I think it's really important that when we look at how that economy is functioning, it really goes back to who is spending that money. And so many studies show that if you are increasing the minimum wages and increasing for that bottom level of working class individuals, that's going to flow back into the economy in a much greater scale than having the top folks being the ones who are earning that money. So, it's my belief that if we're paying workers living wages, that we will see the immediate return on our local economies. Now, I can tell you, as my husband, again, being a small business owner, he doesn't hire quite entry-level folks. He's in the IT field, so it's a little bit higher wages, but it is a constant topic of conversation of how much do we pay our entry-level workers. And when it looks at from a business perspective, when you are paying people a living wage and paying them what their value is, what they're worth, then you're saving money because your turnover is not nearly as high. And every time you bring in somebody new, you've got to train them, and that costs money. And so if you give someone a stable job, and I will go ahead and add too, this isn't part of the question, but you give them benefits, you make them want to come to work, they're much less likely to quit and have to have that turnover rate. So, our employers, while up front, like first day, obviously it can be a big hit when we've got the minimum wage changes, but over the course of time, when you're looking at your fiscal budget, you're saving so much more money from not having to retrain folks over and over again.
What's your stance? Jonah Gann would like to know, what is your stance on the Equal Rights Amendment? How do you feel like you could change the United States or Missouri, since that's more your jurisdiction?
Yeah. So I actually just recently watched the Netflix documentary about the Equal Rights Amendment. If you haven't watched it yet, I really encourage you to. It's very interesting, just looking at the historical context of this. So obviously, folks have been working on the ERA longer than I've been alive. I think at this point, I definitely support it. I think it's something that we should do. I think it is almost more a statement than it would have direct impact on things. Like there are things that it would impact in terms of lawsuits and things and protections for discrimination when you are, say you are being discriminated against in the workplace. It gives extra credence for that. It also increases the standard, and there are things that it would do. But I believe for me, it's almost more of a statement that we support the equal rights across the board, gender equality. You are paid what you're worth, and that if you don't pay folks what they're worth, it's going to be problematic. In terms of whether or not it's going to pass, there's one more state that needs to be ratified. I do think that's going to happen relatively soon, because it is such an important statement for our country to say that women should be paid the same as men for the same job performance. Obviously, if we want to get into the nuanced conversation, if someone's not doing their job well, shouldn't be paid well. But what the Equal Rights Amendment says is that, you cannot pay someone less simply because they're a woman. And I think that in 2020, it's so long past due, it's almost weird that we're still having the conversation.
Haley Heitville wants to know, what is your opinion on abortions and why?
Yes, so I am 100% supportive of a woman's right to choose. And when it comes to why, the very easy answer is I believe in bodily autonomy. And but then let's get a little bit more nuanced. In Missouri, we currently have the most restrictive abortion laws in the entire country. Mississippi got a lot of news 2 years ago because their bill passed first. But House Bill 126 that passed 2 years ago now made it so you cannot get an abortion in our state after 8 weeks of pregnancy. I can tell you as a mom, it takes a hot minute to know if you're pregnant, and knowing by 8 weeks is not the easiest thing in the world. But beyond that, that bill also, if it does go into effect, would affect our over-the-counter emergency contraception, also known as Plan B, which, if any of you don't know what Plan B is, it essentially prevents the egg from implantation. So say you have a condom that breaks and you don't want to get pregnant, you take Plan B so that the egg does not attach to the uterine wall and create the child. And it would outlaw that as well. Which is why it makes it most extreme. But also add to it, House Bill 126 does not give any exceptions for rape or incest in the state of Missouri. Now, you may be asking yourself, like, what? That's crazy. It has not gone into effect yet because it's currently being challenged in the courts, and I imagine that will go on for a while. But to just say, like, big picture, if Roe versus Wade was to ever get overturned, it would immediately go into effect, and Missouri would be one of the most restrictive in the country. We are currently, without that law going into effect, one of the most difficult places to get an abortion. You can only get an abortion in St. Louis. If you wanted to do the abortion pill, which is a non-surgical, you just take a pill and you essentially have a miscarriage. You have to wait 72 hours. You have to go and get an ultrasound, wait 72 hours, do another ultrasound, and then to be given a pill. It's not even a surgical thing. So all of that said, why do I support it? Listen, beyond just a woman's control of her body, for me, there's a huge financial implication around this. I grew up in poverty. My husband had his first kid when he was 16. I grew up in a family where that was very common. And I also, saw lots of women who had many, many children, couldn't feed them, and then found themselves in a situation where they weren't planning to get pregnant and they were. And it's like, what do you do? I don't think that the government should have any say in how I don't think the government should have a say in what happens between you and your doctor. When my husband went to get a vasectomy, the government had no say. They weren't involved in that, right? But when it comes to me, if I, had a health risk and wanted to make that choice post 8 weeks, I've got 3 kids. And if I'm going to die because of a pregnancy, that affects so much more than I think the government should have a say in. I understand it is a very touchy topic for a lot of people. There's a lot of emotion and religious aspects of all of that. But I am a firm believer in a woman's right to choose and will always stand by that. And if anyone ever wants to have a more serious dialogue offline about that and talk through it, I am definitely more than happy to.
Ma'am, Giovanni Sanchez quotes your own website back to you. He says, since you believe in the importance of having affordable and accessible education, do you think college education should be free?
So I definitely believe that community colleges should be free. I do. Now, getting there is a larger conversation, and it's not something that happens through the state government. That is a federal thing, because it is much bigger when it comes to how we pay for that. I do not, at this point, support a 4-year degree being free. And I say that because I don't believe that you have to have a 4-year degree to be successful. And I think that our education system should be reflective of how our economy and society is currently functioning. And right now, it's really hard to get a job without certifications, right? Say you want to go into IT or construction or any of the trades fields, you need to have certifications for that. I don't want to say that you can't get a job without an associate's or without certifications. It's possible. My husband runs a business and he has a GED. You know, it's possible, but it's not easy. And so I believe that we should find ways to support community college education through the federal government. And then if folks wanted to do a 4-year degree from there, you know, we could have the further discussion. Now, the second follow-up question to that, with a person not being there, is how do we pay for it? And that's always the question for everything. How do we pay for it? You know, there are so many tax loopholes and things that corporations are getting, both at the state level and the federal level, and corporate tax giveaways that could pay for so many things. And so yeah, I definitely believe in that.
Stay on education for a minute, because Brian Walters asks, well, he mentions that these days funding for education is gradually being stripped away. So he asks, why is money being stripped away from education instead of other areas? And how have your efforts helped or not helped to increase funding?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So back earlier when I said that I think the budget is the most important thing we do, this is exactly why. The budget should be a moral document for our state. I think it is the moral document for our state. Where we put our money tells you what we believe in. And education is always first on the chopping block, always. Since I have been in office, we've seen over $30 million in transportation cuts to K-12 education. We've seen college tuitions increase across the board because they're continuously getting cut. The why, I will say, is while I don't agree with it and I would not make those choices if I'm in charge, it is one of the easier places to cut funding from in terms of ability. So we are mandated as a state government to pay for certain things. We absolutely have to cover Medicaid. Now we can change what your qualifications are. We can change who gets it, but we have to pay for it, right? And there's a lot of things like that. Education is something that we don't have to pay for. We pick it. And so things that come out of our general revenue fund are definitely the first places that we go when we need to have C funding cuts. It's not what I would choose, but there is some discussion around the ability of just making those cuts being easier from education. Now, all of that said, I think there are a lot of other places we could be cutting from instead of education, particularly higher ed. Since I've been in office, we've seen a lot of cuts to higher ed. So the second piece of that question, what have I done to help with that? Well, my first 2 years, I served on the budget committee. And then my final 2 years as floor leader, I have worked very closely with folks to try to get funding in community colleges. We actually did a great thing last year where we changed the funding formula. And again, I won't get into the weeds of all of that, but we changed the way that community colleges were getting money. And we were very instrumental in that, which was exciting to see, as well as making sure Missouri State gets funding in the budget. There's been new programs, the nursing school that is being built, that I was an integral part of. One of the cool things about Springfield, whether on both sides of the political aisle, we have the Speaker of the House is from Springfield. You have the minority floor leader from Springfield. The budget chair is just outside of Joplin. And then we have Senator Lincoln Huff, who's our senator here in Springfield, who serves on the budget committee. So we have a lot of, quote, powerful positions who represent Southwest Missouri. And so I can say that our universities and OTC, our community colleges, have not gotten the brunt of it, I guess is the best way to say that, because we have a lot of folks advocating to keep as much as we can.
2 more questions. The first, let's stay on education for one more question. Mary Klump asks, do you believe in school choice?
So right now in the state of Missouri, we have school choice we have charter schools in St. Louis and Kansas City. There's been a movement every year that I've been in Jefferson City, both to expand charter schools throughout the state, but then also have what are called school vouchers. And that's essentially state funding to follow a kid to go to private institutions. So say your public school is not giving you what you need and you want to go to a religious school, having that money that is taxpayer dollars funnel through with that kid and go to that private institution. So it's kind of a twofold. We have vouchers and we have charter expansion. Both of those fall under school choice. I do not support school choice, and here is why. Right now in the state of Missouri, our charter schools are not held to the same standards as our public schools. What that means is their local school boards are not locally elected. They are folks from anywhere. They could literally not live in the country and be on the school, or in the state and be on the school board. They don't have to adhere to the same testing regulations. They don't have to adhere to the same admission policies. So they can pick and choose which kiddos go to their schools. We have lots of great charter schools in our state. I believe the first to say it. But until our schools are held to the same standard, I don't think that public taxpayer money should be going to those schools. When you have discussions, and of course, everybody's got a different opinion, right? But when you have discussions with our school leaders throughout the state, when we talk about having a charter school come into a place like Springfield, that directly takes taxpayer money away from our public education system. Point blank, it does, and no one refutes that. And for me, that's problematic because I am a firm believer in equal opportunity for our kiddos. You know, everybody starts at a different level, and that from economic status, from race, you know, lots of different barriers. And when they come into school, they're not at the same place. Nobody can be. The last thing we need to do is then add additional barriers to making school not equitable. And so I don't support school choice. Now, if we had conversations around changing those regulations, making sure charter schools had to adhere to the same stuff, you know, then I would be open to that discussion, but we don't have that right now. And when it comes to vouchers, same boat. I think that taxpayer money should be going to public entities, and that what it makes this conversation really hard is you may have a public school kiddo with really great parents who are super active and fighting for what their kid needs, and the public school isn't giving it to them, so they find another school who can. And you may have a different kiddo with the same needs and a parent who doesn't have the same abilities to advocate for them. And I don't think government should be essentially rewarding one child over another. It's not our job to do that. Our job is to make sure that everybody has the same opportunities.
Last question is kind of just about you, a little bit personal question about you from Evie Coulter. What's it like being in a man's world? Do you ever get looked down upon because you're a woman and a Democrat? Do you get taken seriously?
Oh man, that's a heavy question. Listen, it's hard. I will never dismiss the fact that being a woman in this world is very difficult. Out of 163 state representatives, less than 40 are women. And then I'm also the youngest floor leader in the history of our state. So that adds to it as well. And I will say that it comes from both sides. When I ran in my primary opponent, one of his supporters at a campaign event called me the nice young girl who just had a baby. My baby was 4 at the time. And, you know, I'm 35, which not that matters, but, you know, there is that kind of mentality all the time. I get winked at, I get hands on the small of my back guiding me through rooms. I get hugs when I don't want them. I get kissed on my cheek when I don't want them, all by my colleagues. The men don't deal with that. I get treated differently if I'm in heels or if I'm in flats. I get treated differently if my hair is done or if it's not. And all of those things are factors that I think through, both on the campaign side as well as when I'm in Jefferson City. You know, if I knock doors in a t-shirt, then they're like, you're not old enough to be running. And, you know, there's that whole dialogue. If I knock doors with my kid, people are like, can you handle it? Can you juggle being a mom and a legislator? Who's going to watch the kids? That's a question I get asked a lot. Where my male colleagues, when they knock doors with their kids or babies, it's like, oh, look, you're such a great dad. Look at you. You care. So it is different. And I will say it's better. I've talked to women in their 70s and 80s who did this work well before me, and it is so much better than it was. But we still have a long way to go. And I don't think that's based on partisanness. That's just the reality. You know, in Jefferson City right now, I said we have less than 40 women. We have 1 Latino in the entire chamber. We have 1 Asian American in the entire chamber. We have 4 LGBT individuals in either side of the Senate or House. We are not very diverse at all. We are about to have our first Asian American woman in Missouri's history sworn in November, which I'm really excited about. But But all that said, there's so much further to go. And so with those challenges, there's definitely, yes, I 100% have to deal with it. And, you figure it out, you navigate it, you create friendships with folks. And I can tell you the women in Jefferson City on both sides of the aisle are all very close. And we work very closely together and do legislation together because there's just so few of us.
Representative, does anybody have any questions or thoughts for her just on the spot? We do have a question. Was it Douglas?
Yeah.
Douglas has a question for you. Please speak up just a little bit.
Yeah, I was wondering, so you say that you support equality, but when you were talking about the issue of police, you said that your opinion doesn't matter as much as a Black person. I'm curious about how you would equate those two.
Well, I think I'm going to challenge you a little bit and say supporting equality means that I believe in equal opportunity for everyone. It means that I don't think folks should be discriminated against because of who they love or who they are. But that doesn't negate the fact that they may have an experience that's different than mine. When it comes to policymaking, we all have opinions, but we need to listen to those who are affected the most or those who have the experience the most, whether it's a farmer who's a legislator. I'm going to listen to him when we're dealing with agriculture way more than I'm going to listen to myself because I am not a farmer. And so I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. I think that they go hand in hand, that you can be 100% supportive of equality while understanding where you are and what place you represent and in your own life experiences. And I think that actually makes you a better ally across the board if you recognize what you know and what you don't know and what you still need to learn and being open to that learning regardless of what the issue is.
Any other question? Yeah, we got a question here. Jack, let's speak up just a little bit.
What is your opinion on homeschooling in your district?
Yeah, so in a time of COVID, all of this education stuff is very different, right? And I will preface this answer with saying, I really hope that when we come out of this crisis, we reevaluate our education system across the board, right? Because what we had didn't set us up for this, in this pandemic for us to be providing a great situation for anyone. So I know a ton of people who were public school advocates and their kids were in public school who have health issues. And so now like one of my good friends is homeschooling her son. She's a scientist and is trying to do both, but he's immunocompromised and he cannot be in school. So I will tell you that this whole situation has really taught me a lot in terms of what we can and can't be doing as a government and what, being open to understanding where parents are coming from in a different way than I was before. All that said, I still really struggle with the concept of vouchers going to homeschoolers because, again, the standards are not quite the same. And so and I hope, like I said, I really hope we have this conversation so that we can move forward and find what works for everybody. If we can move to having those homeschool standards the same across the board and testing the same and, making sure that all of that's aligned, then I am definitely open to having that conversation further. I know lots of people who are homeschooled and our Speaker of the House was homeschooled. Obviously, he's successful. I have no qualms with that. For me, it's the financial piece. But like I said, I really hope that post-COVID, we have these conversations in a real valuable way because I think that we have a lot to learn from this crisis to make sure that our kiddos all get what they need.
Anybody else have any thoughts, questions, comments? Lawson, go ahead.
Is there anything in the works to ensure a living wage for people who live in Missouri?
Yes, so a couple years ago, we did pass a minimum wage increase in our state by a vote of the people. I believe that will be fully implemented in 2024. It's a staggered thing. Many studies show that even once we get to the full implementation, it's not going to be a living wage. And so that's lots of folks have different opinions on that. I will be very honest with you and say that in Jefferson City, there is zero appetite for any sort of increases in wages. As I said, my first year when the city of St. Louis implemented their own increase, the legislature undid it. The minimum wage increase that was passed on by a vote of the people, the very next year, there were 10, maybe 12 bills to try to break that apart and undo pieces of it, trying to cut out school workers, which some of this actually did make it through the House but trying to make it so that if you're a private school employee, you don't get the minimum wage increase. There were like exceptions like that that were already moving through the process the moment that became law. So unfortunately right now there is not much discussion, to be honest with you, because the majority of folks there don't believe that we should be doing that.
Questions, comments? Another one from Lawson, sir?
Well, a follow-up question. Why is it that it seems lawmakers keep trying to gut out programs to increase the living wage?
Yeah, I think honestly, there's partisan stuff in there, and we could talk partisanship if we wanted to, but I think it goes back to what I first kind of talked about why I wanted to run for office. We don't have enough people in Jefferson City who feed their family off of working at McDonald's, right? And the system is set up so that's virtually impossible. We're gone 5 months out of the year. We have to pay for our travel. I have to have an apartment in Jeff City, right? Like it's the system makes it so that is very difficult. But with that, there's not enough people there who have lived that experience. And I think we could push that across the board to all of these issues that we've talked about, right? And that's why I think it's so important that folks engage in the political process, even if you can't run for office, meeting with your legislators, having coffee with them, calling them, because we are home throughout the year. And so like demanding those meetings so you can say, look, I can't run for office because I'm working this minimum wage job and this is my life, but here's why this matters to me. I have seen minds change from folks who did not live an experience and met with enough people that they did change their mind. And it happens every day, even in a state like Missouri. So that's why I really encourage you all, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, to meet with us and hold us accountable and ask for things. Because there are just so many folks in Jeff City right now that don't have a diverse experience.
Okay, any other thoughts? Parker?
Do you know Hannah Brashears?
Hannah worked on my campaign.
Okay, I was checking.
Jack, did you have another one?
Yeah, one more question. How can we better protect our elderly who live in retirement homes from COVID-19?
That's an outstanding question.
It is an outstanding question. I think first and foremost, it's making sure that they have enough supplies that they need. That was one of the first things that we really tried to do with the federal money. And some of it has gone out. I don't want to make it sound like it hasn't. But making sure that each one of those facilities has everything that they need, no questions asked. The second piece of that is I know these facilities are really struggling with staffing right now because our nursing home staff are already underpaid, overworked people. They always struggle with trying to find people to work there. And then you add a pandemic on top of that, people don't want to go to work in that environment. And so, we should really be looking at incentives to get folks into that field, into working with them. And we could even be doing that right now on a short-term basis with this emergency status that we're currently in. So it's, unfortunately, a lot of it goes back to money. But in my opinion, that should have been one of the first things that we did, was make sure that all of that was there. As I mentioned, I've lost someone to COVID, and it was a nursing home situation. And I know so many people who have, and it's just, you get one person in there and there's no way to contain it. And so I think it's really incumbent on us as the government to make sure that they have everything that they need, whether it's, masking, PPEs, but as well as trying to get staff in the door.
Anybody else? Thoughts, questions? Round of applause. Oh, sorry, before round of applause, did you have a thought, Rocky?
So like I was wondering, because I know you said that your husband owns like a business. So like during the pandemic, like what were you guys doing for small business owners? Like when we went like through the shutdown, and I know like a lot of companies like lost lots of money and stuff. Like what were you guys trying to do for those small businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when the COVID first happened, Jefferson City kind of shut down for a couple of weeks, and then we went back. One of the things that we really pushed through and actually got through, but I have to give credit to Democrat Wes Rogers in the House, and Senator Lauren Arthur in the Senate. We created a small business grant program specifically for Missouri. So, there was the federal PPP loans that folks could apply for, but I'm sure you all know that money went super quickly and it was really hard to get. And then they did another round and it was still a problem. We had a lot of small business owners who did not qualify. So we were able to secure about $12 million in the state budget to specifically be for those small business owners who fell in the gaps. Unfortunately, because the way government works, we're just now seeing that money go out the door. And so there was obviously a huge lag time there. But we did that stuff back in March. We tried to do additional things for small businesses. We actually asked for 60 million. They gave us 12. We tried for a bigger chunk of that. But then also, funneling that money that we received from the federal government down to the cities, where then the cities did their own grant programs through the small business apparatus at the city. I think that is the key piece, is just making sure that that businesses were able to keep payroll, keep their doors open, Obviously, a lot of them weren't able to get income. And so being able to keep that payroll while there was no income was vital. What stinks about this whole situation is none of it was done fast enough. And so I know that we have a lot of businesses who will not come back from this, especially on the restaurant industry side.
All right, any more thoughts, questions, comments? All right, once again, round of applause. Thank you so much. Appreciate you taking your time. Take care.
Of course, thank you.